Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video will be entitled Twilight Zone, as a metaphor for the meta-universe that we find ourselves today in 2023, at war, fighting for our lives, fighting for freedom from techno-enslavement, travel restrictions, obedience scores, sheltering in place, also known as incarceration. When you shelter in place, you are voluntarily going to the county jail, except you may have a few creature comforts in your prison. Anyway, I'm going to review with you 4 television episodic series that were produced during the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s that I personally watched a lot of these television shows. And I took 3 of the 4 shows very seriously, as serious as a heart attack, as Elvis Presley used to say. All right, so those shows in chronological order were Rod Serling's executive produced and created Twilight Zone, which produced 156 episodes from 1959 through 1964. So before, during, and after the John Kennedy assassination and the Gary Powers fake shootdown, we had the Twilight Zone episodes. And I'm going to circle back to that in a moment to tell you what my definition of Twilight Zone is. The second television show that I watched quite a bit was, of course, Buddy Ebsen's Beverly Hillbillies, which ran on CBS from 1962 through 1971. Twilight Zone was also a CBS Masonic Eye distributed television show. So those 2, the Beverly Hillbillies, which pumped out 274 episodes, and the Twilight Zone, which pumped out 156 episodes in half the time, those are both distributed by Columbia Broadcasting Systems, also known as CBS Entertainment subsidiary. So they're 2 CBS platform social messaging shows. Twilight Zone and the Beverly Hillbillies, which gave you a tutorial on banking and bankers and surveillance and 24/7 monitoring of your activities and your household. Because Milburn Drysdale, the president of the Commerce Bank of Beverly Hills, he was the next door neighbors to the Clampetts, who lived at 750 Bel Air Road, where Lachlan Murdoch and his lovely wife Sarah live after they remodeled it. Remember, that was the home, 18 bedrooms, 25 bathrooms, the home that Jerry Lewis produced a film called Cinderfella in 1960. Right above where Ronald Reagan ended up being installed at 666 St. Cloud Road, below the Clampett Mansion. Tennis court, fountains, plural. Now it has a 40-car underground subterranean garage and a wine cellar that can hold 12,000 bottles of wine. I wonder how thirsty Lachlan Murdoch is. That's like a couple $1 million worth of wine. Has a 75-foot swimming pool, which the Clampetts refer to as the Cement Pond. And behind the Cement Pond, you will see the Sharon Tate murder scene. It's within 1,000 meters distance, okay? Has also a luxurious guest house on the property, and allegedly it sold for $150 million to Lachlan Murdoch in 2019. And there have only been 6 real estate transactions for residential property over $100 million in the history of Los Angeles County. So it's at $150 million, so it's probably in the top 3 real estate transactions of all time in CIA Hollywood. But since they use kind of play money over there, don't be put off by the $150 million, because I'm pretty sure that Lachlan Murdoch didn't use his real personal money, right? Because I think we've learned that these billionaires do not control all their money. So let's just say the bank helped along the property. We learned that from the Beverly Hillbillies, did we not? The third television show that I took rather seriously as sort of a documentary show was Columbo, featuring a Jewish man named Peter Falk, who portrayed himself as Italian on camera as Columbo, Lieutenant Frank Columbo of the Los Angeles Robbery Homicide Division. But then also when he was out of character, he was always Italian, talking about lasagna and hanging out with Frank Sinatra and chumming it up with Dean Martin. But he's Jewish, okay? And his executive producer, Philip Saltzman, is Jewish. The creators of Columbo, William Link and Richard Levinson, they're Jewish, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Like, nobody's really from Hollywood. You know, you'll notice that produces these successful hit television shows and films. They're actually not from California. They're from New York. They're from the Bronx. You know, Peter Falk was born in the Bronx. Okay, the bankers are from New Rochelle, New York, Mount Vernon, New York, the Bronx, Fordham University, Columbia University seems to appear in and out a lot of these stories. Then they end up on Sand Hill Road, across the street from the Linear Accelerator Department of Energy, Stanford University. It's just quirky to me that all of these, successful Jewish people come from New York, Montreal, Toronto. But they do. And it's not just a coincidence either. All right, there is a fourth television series that I watched a lot, Star Trek, featuring Leonard Nimoy and William Shatner. I didn't take that seriously, though. I thought that was pure entertainment, science fiction, spoof. But I did enjoy the episodes of Star Trek. That was an NBC distributed television show, and Columbo with Peter Falk and Philip Saltzman, that was also distributed by NBC. So there you have 4 television shows, 2 produced by the Columbia Broadcasting System through CBS Entertainment, and 2 produced by NBC, National Broadcasting Corporation, and their entertainment television division, NBC TV. All of them Jewish managed, 100%, no exceptions. All have Jewish CEOs, all have Jewish executive vice presidents. All right? There's no exception. None! But of those 4, I only took Twilight Zone seriously. I took the Beverly Hillbillies show seriously, even though it's supposed to be a situation comedy. I took it as a serious banking documentary. And I took Peter Falk's Columbo How Do You Catch Him series. Remember, it's not a whodunit. They tell you up front who did the murder and what their motives were. It's more of how do I catch him. It's a how do I catch him format. Anyway, I took that seriously because it was a documentary of clandestine service black ops murders. There is always a scapegoat. There is always a alibi, a pretty much ironclad alibi that Columbo has to break in order to implicate the real killer, right? And of course, it's completely and utterly unrealistic because in real life, we know, like with the Sharon Tate murder, with the Dr. Victor Ota murders, with respect to 9/11, with respect to Pearl Harbor, with respect to the destruction and explosion of the USS Maine in the port of Havana, Cuba, in February 1898, with respect to Pearl Harbor, with respect to the Vietnam War, all the battles of the Vietnam War, the real enemy gets away. The real enemy gets away. They always get away. Always. That's how it is in real life. And that's why Hollywood wants to give you this social messaging that if you work hard and you're smarter than the average bear, that you can be successful. But that's kind of untrue, right? It's a way of playing orchestra music on the decks, on the Lido deck of the Titanic as it heads to the bottom of the ocean, of the North Atlantic. It's at least 300 feet down. So, pacification and control is the message of television. And of course, our dear friend Erin Valenti told us on October 7th, 2019, her last words spoken to her mother in New York State, were, "It's all a game, it's a thought experiment, we're in the Matrix." Okay, well, another way of describing it is we're in the Twilight Zone, right? So let's explore the meaning of Twilight Zone. It has multiple meanings, as you can imagine. And let's have some fun with this Twilight Zone business, because it is a metaphor for today's situation. So, technically, there are two definitions of Twilight Zone. I believe there's more than two. Anyway, a conceptual area that is undefined, or an intermediate area. You know, a Twilight Zone between the middle and working classes, if there is such a thing anymore. I think we're just going from a privileged class to a lower privileged class to a zero privileged class society. Anyway, it's a sphere of experience that appears sinister or dangerous because of its uncertainty, unpredictability, or its ambiguity. Well, that's a very excellent definition of Twilight Zone, because that applies to cackling cacophony of chaos Vice President Kamala Harris. She is a sphere of bizarreness that appears sinister or dangerous because of her ambiguity. Okay, it is also technically, a second definition is the lowest level in the ocean to which light can penetrate. So it's the area just before darkness. It's where the light fizzles out. And that is why it seems foggy, that we're all in the fog of war, because we are at war, and it does appear uncertain and ambiguous, right? Because they still have the Super Bowl, and they have NBA basketball, and they're going to promote the Tour de France this year. And in other words, they have circuses, lots of circus productions, so that you don't notice that the prison walls are going up. I get it. Anyway, that's the Twilight Zone. Now, we have the Rod Serling definition of the Twilight Zone. Let's talk a little bit about Rod Serling before I tell you what some of his thoughts were. His name is Rodman Edward Serling, and he was born December 25th, 1924. He died kind of early. He died June 28th, 1975. He was only 50 years old when he died. And that is a red flag. You know, we notice that there's a lot of homicides that go on in Hollywood, right? So let me tell you the cause of death for Rod Serling. It was very successful at CBS television, if I can. But the problem is there's not a lot of information about how he died. So this is kind of a problem, right? So he died at age 50. So right there, that's suspicious. He was Jewish, however. And he did have military service. Anyway, he was born in Syracuse, New York, to a Jewish family. He was the second of the two sons born to Esler Cooper and Samuel Lawrence Serling, spelled Serling. He later became known as Rod Serling. Rod Serling's father worked as a secretary and amateur inventor before his children were born, but then he worked for his father-in-law's business as a grocery store so he could have more steady income. That's sort of like a Lino LaBianca story. Go into the grocery business. All right. Rod Serling spent most of his youth south of Syracuse in Binghamton, New York. For you New Yorkers of the Empire State, you know where Binghamton is. They have an excellent motocross national racetrack there. In elementary school, Rod Serling was often viewed as the class clown, and he was dismissed by many of his teachers as a lost cause. In other words, he's going his own way. He was interested in radio at an early age, of course. Military service, he served at the United States Army after graduating high school. And so did his older brother Robert. Rod Serling began his military Army career at Camp Toccoa in Georgia under General Joseph May, also known as Joseph May Swing, and Colonel Orrin D. Hard Rock Hagen. He served in the 511th Paratrooper Infantry Regime. So it's kind of like William Colby, Army Airborne. Anyway, he eventually reached the rank of Technician 4th grade, known as T4. All right. So, not that particularly fascinating, really. But let's talk about his biggest success, which is the creation of the Twilight Zone. Okay? The Twilight Zone. Marketed as Twilight Zone. It's an American science fiction horror anthology television series that was created and presented by Rod Serling. The season ran from October 2nd, 1959 until June 19th, 1964. Each episode presented a standalone story in which the characters find themselves dealing with often disturbing or unusual events, and experienced described as entering the Twilight Zone, often with a surprise ending and a moral to the story. The genre is anthology, horror, and science fiction. Of course, Rod Serling didn't do it alone, right? He's surrounded by Jewish composers and co-producers. He's got a whole platoon of Jewish people to help him get this show off the ground. Writers, directors, and co-producers chiming in with creative ideas for the Twilight Zone, because I can assure you that Rod Serling did not produce personally, solo, by himself, 156 episodes. He had help. He did provide narrations. And let's have a little fun with some of Rod Serling's opening comments to the Twilight Zone. They're really quite funny. All right, is known as You're Entering the Twilight Zone. So what are some examples? Imagine, if you will, a world which the police become the enemy. The government spies on its citizens, that the IRS is used to silence opposition. Patriots are called terrorists, and terrorism is called workplace violence. And the Democrats' leading candidates are socialists and old women who are under FBI investigations. Can you imagine that? You have just crossed over into the Twilight Zone. It's the year 2023. You have entered the Twilight Zone. The tools of conquest do not necessarily come with bombs and explosions and fallout. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, which can be found only in the minds of men. And for the record, prejudices can kill, and suspicion can destroy. A thoughtless, frightened search for a scapegoat has a fallout of its own for the children, and the children yet unborn. And the pity of it is that these things cannot be confined to the Twilight Zone. Rod Serling himself said that in 1960. Imagine, if you will, a world in which a major political party has lost touch with reality so severely that they don't deny the usefulness of something as basic as a wall. Keep calm and enter the Twilight Zone. What you're about to watch is a nightmare. Imagine its limits are only those of the mind itself, says Rod Serling. With a one-way ticket to the Twilight Zone, arrow pointing Your fingers have fingertips, but your toes do not have toe tips. And yet you can tiptoe, but not tip finger. You have crossed over into the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is about people, about human beings involved in extraordinary circumstances, in strange problems of their own or fate's making. But any place and all places can be the Twilight Zone. We will not end the nightmare. We will only explain it. Earl Hallman was the first Twilight Zone episode, entitled, "Where is Everyone?" Imagine, if you will, living in a country where it is better to be unemployed and undocumented than it is to be employed as a United States citizen. See, if you're documented, they've got you digitally passported, don't they? The narration is, when the aliens arrive on Earth, this village had a virus shared by its people. You have now entered the Twilight Zone. Everything makes perfect sense in the Twilight Zone. You don't need a boyfriend, you just need a good night's sleep. You are about to enter the friendship zone. All right, enough of that. I think you got the point. Is that we're in the Twilight Zone. It's where up is down, left is right, ugly is beautiful, smart is dumb, dumb is trendy. But let me give you some of my personal examples of the Twilight Zone. I think it's a Twilight Zone that Natalie Wood's real name is Natasha Zakharenko. And I think it's Twilight Zone. She was born in San Francisco, CIA San Francisco, the town where Diane Goldman Feinstein was born. I understand that she's been hospitalized. They really won't say why or where. Anyway, I think it's a Twilight Zone that Natalie Wood is then repositioned from the city by the bay, San Francisco, to Van Nuys, San Fernando Valley, the porn center, and then she is integrated into Hollywood and appears in a film with Orson Welles in 1946 at age 8. And Natalie Wood has a speaking role, and the film is entitled Tomorrow is Forever. But we know that tomorrow was not forever for Natalie Wood. She was murdered at age 43 in November 1981 in Santa Catalina, the harbor there. She was thrown into the water at 3 o'clock in the morning like a sack of potatoes. And Christopher Walken knows who did that. And so does RJ, Robert John Wagner. And so does the captain of the yacht, the Splendor. And I think it's a Twilight Zone that Natalie Wood, after appearing with Orson Welles in Tomorrow is Forever, when we knew it wasn't, goes on to star in the film Splendor in the Grass with Warren Beatty, who played Ben Siegel, who was killed by a military semi-automatic M1 rifle in Beverly Hills 90210. You know, where Abigail Folger and Sharon Tate were killed by a military weapon in Benedict Canyon, Beverly Hills 90210, just like Ben Siegel was. And Ben Siegel was portrayed as Warren Beatty, who is the younger brother of Shirley MacLaine, who Shirley MacLaine met Premier Khrushchev from Russia when he came out to California and visited Hollywood and Paramount Pictures. He met with Frank Sinatra, Gary Cooper, and Shirley MacLaine at the Paramount Pictures studio. Yes, he did. Look it up. He wanted to go to Disneyland, but the mayor of Los Angeles refused. It's a security risk. I think that's a Twilight Zone. A guy comes all the way from Moscow and you won't let him go to Disneyland. Isn't that fascinating? So we have the yacht, the Splendor, that Natalie Wood slept over on before she died, and they passed Dennis Wilson's yacht on the way out of Marina del Rey on her last voyage. And she appeared in the movie Love Splendor in the Grass, which is a love story amongst high school kids. And I think it's more than a Twilight Zone that William Holden was murdered 1 week before Natalie Wood was murdered. And he is best known for many films, but my favorite is Love is a Many Splendored Thing. William Holden. Natalie Wood. What do you think the mathematical probability is that Natalie Wood would have a boat, a 64-foot yacht named the Splendor, and would appear in Splendor in the Grass, a love story? Or that she would personally know William Holden, who was a star of Love is a Many Splendored Thing, who's dating Stephanie Powers, who's 30 years younger than him. William Holden's girlfriend is Stephanie Powers. She is starring in a television show with Robert Wagner, who's the husband of Natalie Wood, who's with her when she's murdered. He's with her when she's murdered. And Stephanie Powers is his co-star from, they play this wealthy detective agency, Heart to Heart. Heart to Heart. So Robert Wagner and Stephanie Powers, who's Polish Jewish, they're in a television show entitled Heart to Heart. And Robert Wagner is married to Natalie Wood on the Splendor, and she's murdered. And William Holden is murdered, 6 days to 8 days before that in 1981, in and around Thanksgiving 1981. What do you think the mathematical chances are that happening randomly? I mean, that is a Twilight Zone question that I am posing to my audience. All right, so that's my example of Twilight Zone. Another is, of course, Orson Welles appears with Sharon Tate in her last film that she ever did before she was murdered by being bayoneted 16 times by a military NATO M7 bayonet. And she appeared in Rome, Italy with Orson Welles in 13 Chairs, also known as 12+1 in France. And so you got Orson Welles appearing with Natalie Wood, who's murdered, and he appears with Sharon Tate, who's murdered. What's the mathematical probability? Have you personally worked with someone over a 40-year career that was murdered? 2 different people? It's like lightning strikes once in a lifetime, twice in a lifetime. I don't know. That's kind of a Twilight Zone scenario. I think it's a Twilight Zone question to ask, how come the producers of the Beverly Hillbillies also produced all of Sharon Tate's films? Martin Rasnoff, MGM, and Columbia CBS Television were represented by Filmways, which signed Sharon Tate to a 7-year contract. That is why she appeared in Don't Make Waves with Tony Curtis down there at Malibu, near the Malibu, Topanga Canyon. Highway 27 and Highway 1, Pacific Coast Highway, and 27 is where they filmed Don't Make Waves. That's also where they filmed the Navy Frogman series that you've never seen, that O.J. Simpson was to star in, where he played a Black Ops Navy SEAL. There's a taqueria across the street there, and there was a surf shop there, and that O.J. Simpson, that was his undercover CIA hangout, was at the surf shop across the street from where Sharon Tate was on a trampoline on Don't Make Waves, starring Tony Curtis, and that was produced by, represented by Filmways and MGM. And you should know that that then Sharon Tate starred in The Eye of the Devil with Donald Pleasance and David Niven. Okay? The Eye of the Devil, and she's killed in a devilish M7 NATO Gladio attack. That's a Twilight Zone. She appears in Valley of the Dolls. Sharon Tate appears in Valley of Dolls. Now that's code for you people that don't know. The Valley is code for San Fernando Valley. Dolls, women who are dolls, are porn stars. San Fernando Valley is Hollywood pornography zip code. That's Van Nuys. That's Canoga Park. That's West Hills. That's Hidden Hills. It's Calabasas. That's Encino. Valley of the Dolls. It's a Twilight Zone concept. It's porn. It's porn. It's where Jose Menendez last worked before he was killed. He only worked in that industry about 9 years, and 3 years at his last job, where he had a $15 million life insurance taken out by his employers, two Jewish gentlemen, Mario Kassar and Andrew Vajna, not his real name, Andres Weidman, who employed Noam Bloom, pornographer to the stars, to work with Jose Menendez. I think it's a Twilight Zone that Jose Menendez would be a chief operating officer executive for RCA, Radio Corporation of America. That's the person who put together the RKO radio pictures with Joseph P. Kennedy, a Jewish man from RCA, put together RKO pictures and then did a photo shoot with Michelle Morgan on the Cielo Drive murder scene property in 1945. Michelle Morgan, who then, instead of moving into the house that was portrayed to us as her love house honeymoon home, she flies to Paris, France, never to come back to Hollywood again. Michelle Morgan, not her real name either. Anyway, I think that's a Twilight Zone that then 24 years later, on March 23rd, 1969, Sharon Tate duplicates that photo shoot with an Iranian CIA photographer 24 years after Michelle Morgan did. Okay? Before Sharon gets on a plane on the 24th of March to fly to Rome to shoot 13 Chairs with Orson Welles. See, they did the photo shoot twice with women who didn't live in the home. Michelle Morgan, who was portrayed as owning and constructing the Cielo Love House, which took 4 years to excavate the land and build the house, and it was Michelle Morgan's house. And she was recently married, so they called it her honeymoon love house. Then 24 years later, you have Sharon Tate repeat that photo shoot, and she gets on a plane and flies to Rome instead of moving into the house. She didn't live in the house. Her clothes are not hanging in the closet. They're in steamer trunks. They were never hanging in the closet at Cielo Drive. All right, so that's a Twilight Zone example. All right, that's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed my interpretation of the Twilight Zone, and we'll come back and look at Beverly Hillbillies another time. Take care. Have a great day.